Welcome everyone online. I'm Bertrand Tate. I'm chairing this launch of Sounding the Siren. I am very glad to welcome you on this webinar, and we are going to, without further ado, introduce the project and then introduce your speakers. So the first point I want to make is that this is a collaborative report which originated from a conversation between old partners, Save the Children, UK-Med, and HCRI, and which at the onset also involved Prepare. So it's a project that was led by Dr. Stephanie Sodero, who is on the panel, and it involved the research of Drs. Rafaela Montando and Mahi Sakalar Surya, and who collaborated on this project and conducted a number of interviews in order to explore what we have come to understand as the difficulties of comprehending and engaging with climate change in the humanitarian sector. Now, we all know that crises have become more complex, or at least complex in a different way, multi-layered in a different way yet again, and that humanitarians are responding to increasingly hybrid crises, disasters and conflict, economic and political instability. Now, we also know, and this is a fact, that emergencies caused by extreme weather events are increasing in volume and also in severity, and that, for example, storms, floods and drought have tripled over the last 30 years. We also know that climate events multiply existing threats or crisis, and that we also understand that communities are finding increasing difficulties in a perpetual rebuild situation. So coupled with COVID-19 and the challenge to the economic world order, we are finding that recoveries take longer, that existing emergencies will worsen, that national budgets are going to be depleted, and that aid funds are failing to meet demand. So there is a nexus of issues that are coming together, and we wanted, through this report, to engage with humanitarians to see how they actually comprehended those problems, how they understood them, and how they actually tackle them in their daily life. Across the sector, we are finding that humanitarians have actually expressed their anxiety about climate change, but also the issues of understanding them in depth. So we drew 7 key findings, which were drawn from interviews with aid workers around the world and through a survey of the literature. And they are going to be highlighted in this report. But before I actually sell the content of this report, I would like to introduce to you our speakers today. And I'm going to ask our speakers to actually introduce themselves and describe their roles. So I will start in the order of my Zoom with my colleague Stephanie Sodero.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie Sodero, and I'm a lecturer in responses to climate crises at the Humanitarian and Conflict Response Institute. And as part of this project, I was involved in overseeing the research component.
Miriam?
Hello, my name is Miriam Lopez. I'm the Global Shelter and Settlement Specialist with NRC. Thank you.
And Claire?
Hi, I'm Claire Stamford. I work as the Director of Humanitarian Transformation with Save UK and was part of the overall steering committee for the research.
David?
Hello, everyone. I'm David Whittick. I'm the CEO of UK-Med, and like Claire, I was part of the steering group for the research.
And Paul?
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul Knox-Clark. I'm a principal of Prepare, which is a new initiative to address issues related to climate change and humanitarian action.
I would like to mention also Holly, who is actually supporting this project and has done an enormous amount of work in this report. So before I actually ask our speakers to speak, I'd like to mention also that there is a way of finding who's who in this room. So there will be a poll that will appear and which will enable you to identify yourself by a category, if not a category you may not want to associate yourself with, but a category regardless. And that's just to give us a sense of who is in the room. When you ask questions, it would be great if you could just put a couple of words to introduce yourself. That would be very helpful to the panelists. So without further ado, we've asked the question, how do we prepare the aid system for the climate emergency from your perspective? And I would like to turn to my colleague Stephanie to launch this particular point.
Thanks, Bertrand. So I am a social scientist interested in how medical supply chains are impacted by severe weather events. And this summer, there was a significant coming of age moment. This was not the plot of a blockbuster movie or an award-winning novel. It was in the realm of climate science. This August, for the first time, climate scientists definitively said that climate change, moving that poll, that climate change, that humans are causing climate change, and that this is unequivocal. And this marks a coming of age moment where there was a prolonged period of awkward adolescence in climate science that relied on hedging language. And now we've moved into a period of assertive adulthood, which is very exciting. However, while the climate science is unequivocal, how the climate emergency expresses itself in the communities in which aid workers operate is very much to be determined and is becoming clearer. And one of the key findings of this research report is that aid workers want support in closing this information gap between high-level science and the expression in the communities in which they operate. To this end, there are three takeaways. The first is that aid workers want a one-stop shop for credible climate data that can be used as a basis for humanitarian strategy. Second, aid workers need support in translating complex climate data into actionable information that can be used to identify resource gaps. And third, aid workers want greater climate literacy to interpret risk and complexity and bring a climate lens to all contexts. Some examples of good practice include the ICRC's online course on sustainability and humanitarian action, and collaborations between bodies such as the Office for Humanitarian Affairs and the World Meteorological Organization to support anticipatory action. So unequivocal climate impacts require unequivocal climate action supported by research. And closing this information gap is one key step in this process. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now we're heading straight into the field of policy and action. So I'll turn to Claire, if that's okay with you.
Thanks, Bertrand. I think for me, the central point which stood out for me within the research was around collaboration beyond our sector and our borders, and the need to generate the groundswell and focused attention to deal with one of the greatest challenges of our time. I think Antonio Guterres summed it up well when he said the climate crisis demanded a transformational change of the humanitarian sector. And that really is exactly what we need. I think there's no one single solution for dealing with the climate crisis. And I think all the research and the reports to date have acknowledged that. And whilst I acknowledge that the impactful work happening both across the humanitarian sector as others is impactful, it's often piecemeal and at too small a scale. I don't feel that we have yet collaborated on a big enough scale to generate the groundswell of focused effort to nudge us over the tipping point. And we need to create a strong galvanizing effect that draws on both our existing efforts in a much more mutually reinforcing and leveraging way. And it needs to be something that both empowers, inspires, and informs organized action. I think what we need and what we're proposing is a much bigger galvanizing platform, something which draws on the unique skills, expertise, and knowledge of critical partners, including local and national governments, civil society, academia, local and international development and humanitarian organisations, but also the less traditional partners, more of the private sector. We've learned by doing it, Save the Children, over the last decade and a half, that collaboration is the only route forward to tackling kind of these wicked global programs. But grand collaboration is both messy and takes time and needs sustained willpower. In 2007, we created the idea for the Humanitarian Leadership Academy, recognising that leadership was the front line of work, and developed a collaboration with other organisations and with the United Nations. And 7 years ago, we secured 50 million to develop the Academy. These days, it has over 400,000 global subscribers on its platform, and more than 50 partners operating in a dozen languages. And we were able to attract significant funding and partnerships from a range of different stakeholders. But it really was about developing a necessarily global good to add learning to the front line. And this is what I believe is the kind of exercise that we need to be engaging in now, something much bigger, much more galvanizing, that really helps bring the climate change efforts together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that seems like a good segue to actually talk to people who were close to the project but not actually associated with the project. So perhaps I'll turn to you, Miriam, if that's okay with you.
Thank you very much. So one of the observations from this study is that emergency shelters are often not built to endure or resist hazards such as floods, thunders, and winter storms, and which put the security of displaced people at risk. I'm highlighting this specific point because this sentence is relevant as it integrates the perspective of the people we serve. It takes us from the aerial view inside the tent, and it makes us expand our attention as we need to attend different and simultaneous aspects. On the one hand, we already hear and acknowledge that there is an increased number of people in need of assistance. And on the other hand, we also need to rethink the typologies and the approaches where traditional humanitarian assistance is insufficient to cope with or under extreme weather conditions. So in plain words, what this means is displaced populations face increasingly harsh conditions, particularly those displaced without adequate shelter and those housebound in protracted crisis, most often women and children and people with disabilities, or people that feel targeted or marginalized. It is not the same to remain inside a tent under extreme cold or under a tin roof in extreme heat. With these extremes we see now compared to the conditions 20 years ago, and it will get harder every year ahead. I think the point I want to highlight that also echo other conversations we are having with our colleagues in different platforms is that people is extremely resilient, but we should define our assistance based on minimum standards or what is needed to recover with dignity, not based on what people can endure. Another point that I wanted to highlight from our conversation connects a couple of recommendations and is echoing what Claire mentioned as well. Plan for scale and collaborate across sectors and actors has been part of our challenges and aspirations for a long time, and we have done some progress. With an increased number of people affected by disaster, no one agency, not even the collective of humanitarian agencies, will aspire to address the needs. What we need to realize is that our partnerships, we need to go beyond of working side by side to deliver assistance to a set number of households or to implement one specific project. Echoing again, what we are listening here is that we need this synergy, we need emergence, we need system thinking and promote the added value of each other to reach a wider sector of the population. Thank you, over.
Thank you very much. This is a very strong call to arms in a way. And Paul, can I bring you into this conversation now from your perspective?
Delighted. Thank you, Bertrand. I think first of all, I'd just like to say, I think the report and the recommendations hit it absolutely on the head. At Prepare, we've also been talking to a different group of stakeholders, but humanitarians, national disaster management agencies, civil society organizations. And what they have been saying aligns very, very closely with this report. So many congratulations to you all for that. It's a compelling message. I think it's a compelling message not only because climate change looks like it will inevitably lead to a bigger response, which is going to be extremely challenging, but also because it's going to lead to a different response. And I'm not sure that thus far this is something that the humanitarian system has really engaged with. A different response with different system required to deliver it. And the reason I say that is fourfold. Firstly, climate change will bring us crises that we are not used to dealing with. We don't necessarily know, we don't necessarily understand. Thinking of things like heat waves, thinking of forest fires, which we generally haven't responded to as humanitarians, thinking of dam collapses as a result of glacial melting. Secondly, it's very likely that climate change will bring us cascading systemic crises. If we think about global droughts, or droughts on broad scale, and what that could do to food security, economies, and politics globally, we very quickly see that we could be looking at lots of COVID-style situations, lots of global complicated situations, which unfold in ways that we're not able to predict as we look over the next 10, 20 years. Thirdly, as has already been mentioned, I think climate is going to bring, and is already bringing for many people, perpetual crises, crises that go on and on and on, where the norm is not the non-crisis year, the norm is the crisis year. And that is a very different profile from what we're used to. And fourthly, all of this is going to be occurring against a global political and economic background, which is fundamentally affected by climate change. Because climate change is not just going to occur in the global south, it's going to occur in donor states as well, and that will have ramifications. Having said that, then, we need a different system. And I, like Claire, would hone in of all the recommendations on recommendation number 5, collaboration beyond sectors. In two ways. I think we've got to, as humanitarians, finally accept and promote the fact that we're not at the center of the crisis universe. We have to promote a system where we are bit parts, supporting actors, and often very much not the star, not very much the center of what's going on. The people who need to be the center of what's going on, and this is something that we've heard, and I'm sure you've heard time and time again, are the communities in the front line. And a fundamental shift is required to allow that to happen. Secondly, and I think it's been talked about already, we need to really have a hard think about the rigid mental and financial and institutional boundaries which keep us in boxes, humanitarian box, development box, resilience box, early action box, because climate change is going to need a bigger boat, and we really are all in this together. So we've got to work as if we mean it.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think we are at an interesting juncture where there is a paradigm shift. We are changing the way we're thinking about pretty much everything we do, but we're also in the full awareness that things are only beginning and that there is much more to come, and the nature of that change is as yet unpredictable. So, David.
Bertrand, thank you. And thanks to everyone else. I was sort of struck, I think, reading the report and also listening to others' comments and working through this over the last year, really, that it's taken to research, compile and produce this, that there's an amount of this that is inevitable. We're not talking about effects on humanitarian response on emergencies worldwide that are possible, or that we're sort of, chewing the fat over, or that may or may not happen. We're talking about a level of inevitability. We're talking about emergencies that are already baked into the system. They're going to happen. What we don't quite know is where, when, and precisely how, but we know they're going to happen. So in that respect, we do have an advantage that we know this is coming at us. And we know that to an extent it's already here. The complexity that was brought out in the research, I think, that needs to be noted is that climate change is not a single cause and effect, it's a multiplier effect. And the challenge of dealing with a multiplier effect was quite stark and led in some cases, I think, to people sort of hoping that somebody else was going to come up with a solution, or that something would present itself down the road, or let's attend to the emergencies now because frankly, it's just too complicated to think about. And I think we have all fallen into that trap over the last decade, either individually or as part of wider agencies. And the one also that I think I would really want to highlight, Paul, you were talking about emergencies becoming the norm. I think this is absolutely something that was starkly highlighted, that no longer are these outlier events, these are now the norm, and we have to treat them as such. And that our planning can at times be unfit for purpose, in that we are planning for what has happened. We're not planning for what is going to happen. And what is going to happen is likely to be larger, more frequent, and at greater scale than what has happened before. And we need to be attendant to that and prepare ourselves. And this, I think, is what really drove a lot of the recommendations that we have come up with in this report. In that, how do we provide a multiplier solution to a multiplier effect? How do we recognize fully that there is no one magic bullet, and we need to be bringing in actors and stakeholders from outside of the traditional humanitarian sector? And again, recognizing, Paul, what you were highlighting, which is we are not the only actor here. And that is why I think we've concentrated. We have 7 principal recommendations, but I think they boil down into information and research. How do we galvanize the information that we've got? And there's a huge amount of information out there. How do we best use it and reflect it in planning frameworks? How do we make it usable to the practitioner sitting in Somalia or Juba or indeed anywhere else, or the National Disaster Management Agency who is struggling to figure out where best to prioritize their resources? So how do we use that information to best effect? And then the second main plank of this, I think, is really about how do we then plan effectively and convince others of how our planning needs to be realized, and how do we best apportion our resources in order to ensure that we have that multiplier solution. And that means training and capacity building people and staff at national level principally, but also recognizing that we're going to need international surge. We need both, but we need to have that real focus at national level to support those countries and contexts on the front line. And thirdly, how do we best communicate? How do we best advocate for what is coming down the road? And how do we ensure that we have clarity of communication, which again goes back to the how do we best use our information? And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. So we're going to take questions in a second. I'd like to make 2 small points. One, a point of clarification in the interest of transparency, that this project was funded by DEC, by the Disaster Emergency Committee, and of course by the resources of UK-Med, HCRI and Save the Children. So I'd like that point to be made very clear. The second point I'd like to make, and I think it's an important one, is that we are at a moment we are in a situation where information is available in an as yet untranslated fashion. Material is available, but we're going to face a situation of increasing observer bias. In other words, when people are better informed, better trained, then they will also recognize more effects of climate change. So in other words, we are just seeing the tip of the iceberg, because we haven't yet developed the tools to analyze what an iceberg is. And I think this, as a sector, we are going to find ourselves confronting an avalanche of data, of information, and a considerable this problem scale will actually appear only in a few years' time, when people have had access to more intelligible and understandable tools to analyze data. So that's the point I wanted to make, because I think it's really interesting from the feedback we had from people working in the field and from encounters we've all had, that many people sometimes find it difficult to correlate what they observe to a general theory of climate change. And perhaps that is one of the aspects that we ought to consider dealing with. Now, a number of questions have emerged, and the first one is, why do you think the media narrative around the climate crisis seems to be less focused on the human impact? Can I turn to you, Miriam, for this one?
Okay. Just can you please repeat? I just sure.
Why do you think the media narrative, this is from Sophie Grattage, around the climate crisis seems to be less focused on the human impact?
Okay, I will need to speculate why, so I will not be able to answer that particularly why, but I can't say again that people is extremely resilient, and we somehow have managed to cope and maintain and survive. And it seems that our standards sometimes are pushed down, 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 down to how much we need to give so people don't die, merely survive. So I think that when we change the perspective and we recognize what are the minimum standards for people to be able to cope and recover, it will be the switch in attention. I think that we need both. We need to zoom in and out. And I think that there is quite a bit of the human story. When we communicate, even in reports, institutional donors, to our social media, we often have that one successful story of one that following the journey of a person or a family. However, we are building these stories separately. And we have this interview or these quotes and these inspirational photos for our web presence, and we are not using that in our project design and strategy thinking. So I think that there is disconnect. I think there is information, but what we need to understand better is to take a different perspective. So why we do that is also what we use the information for. If we demand more of that perspective, if we insist of not only changing the name of how we call the people we serve, beneficiaries, people affected for displacement, it's not only about the names we use or the terms we use, it's more about our approach. So I think until we use that human stories, until we use that stories, is that we are going to see more on this reporting. It might be a reason. Thank you. Over.
Thank you very much. Now, we have a number of questions coming talking about money. So I'm going to invite several of you to respond to these questions. So the first one is from Mariam. What are the best ways for aid agencies to work with the private sector, and how do we ensure that profit isn't prioritized over people? And then the second question from Lizzie is, how can we achieve all this with the billions of dollars deficit in required funding for climate change mitigation? She describes it as an impossible question, but let's move on with that. We'll try to make it a possible question. So could I turn to Paul, perhaps, to start with, and maybe somebody else may want to jump in. Claire, you may want to come in as well. So Paul, you want to come in?
Thank you. Shall I have a go at the impossible question?
Go for that.
I mean, I think we have to assume, I think it's a great question, but I think we have to assume, firstly, that these deficits will, one way or another, be addressed, because it will increasingly be in the interests of state donors to do so. As we've said, whilst the impacts of climate are not equal in any way, and they will always hit the most vulnerable people in the poorest countries first and worst, it is a global crisis. So I think we need to assume that the political, late perhaps, but that there will be political focus around financing climate change mitigation. But even if that is the case, of course, there is the secondary point, which also goes back to the media point, that financing climate change mitigation is not going to do very much for the people that David was talking about, who have already and are already suffering the impacts of climate change, even if, as Bertrand, you say, that's not always recognized because we don't know what to look for. And I think the answer to that is going to be, and it's something that humanitarians perhaps have not engaged in as much as we ought to have done, it's going to be the other part of the climate negotiations, the element of adaptation, and particularly the discussions around loss and damage financing. Now, the loss and damage element has been, if you like, the poor relation of the poor relation. This is financing to support, actually at the moment, mainly states, but ideally civil society as well, to respond to and make up for the damage that is done by climate change, both humanitarian damage and also cultural and other kinds of damage. Now, surely humanitarians should be involved in those discussions more than we are. Surely we should be pushing for the world to be putting money aside for loss and damage funding, and not just diverting existing development funding, which is what's happening currently, to the loss and damage or to the adaptation area. So it's a very hard ask. It's a particularly hard ask after COVID, but there are discussions about this. There is a political momentum about this. Humanitarians are being asked by climate change experts and civil society to put our shoulders to the wheel, and we're not necessarily doing so very well. It looks like, to my understanding, this will not probably be a big issue in Glasgow, but the Egyptian presidency for the next COP is going to focus very much on this. So we've got some time to really pull ourselves together and push for more money for the people who need it most.
Thank you very much. Claire, do you want to come back on the issue of the thorny issue of PPP, well, public-private partnerships?
I can, and other panelists may want to join in and give their perspective. But I mean, from Save the Children's perspective, you know, we have a strong private sector partnerships team, and we operate with private sectors across many different areas, whether it's the financial services sector or the tech sector or the you know, the different realms of spaces that we work in. And historically, I think, you know, if we go back 10 years, it was very much about, you have an organization that has their CSR strategy and they want to fund a unique specific project in X country, and we develop the project and they fund it. And I think, you know, what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is a much greater transition into these shared valued partnerships, where we're taking on board, you know, these particular challenges that we're facing as organizations, and recognizing that, you know, as Save the Children or as any of the organizations that are on this call, you know, we have the relationships, the expertise, the national capability, the experience of working in these countries. And then, you know, how do we couple that with other areas that perhaps we don't hold or perhaps we don't have? And certainly some of the partnerships that I've seen developed across Save the Children in the last 5 years have been hugely impactful in helping us deal with some of these big challenges. But it's much more focused around the skills and expertise, the knowledge, the supply chains, the global footprint or the reach that the private sector has that helps us tackle these problems and solves and works on them together. So I think they are absolutely a fundamental component in terms of how we move the dial forward in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, and they're absolutely integral to us being able to do that. I think, how do organisations do it? I think we're fortunate as Save the Children that we have a team that works on this. But I also think, you know, looking at some of the bigger collaborations that we've developed, whether it's START, whether it's ELRA, whether it's the HLA, or whether it's potentially this future climate crisis alliance, I think, you know, we need these bold collaborations where lots of different organisations from on this call or from around the world are operating together with private sector partners in it. So it isn't just a distinct, it's Save the Children's private partnership, it's a broader collaboration of partnerships working together.
Thank you very much. The next question has several layers. So I will take the final layer. And that is for you, I think, Stephanie. So will there ever be a possibility of being prepared for what may come? What do you think?
Thanks for the easy question there, Bertrand. Yeah, that is how to deal with uncertainty and complexity. I was thinking of the heat dome that impacted Vancouver and the North Pacific this summer. And it took people by surprise, even though we've been anticipating and observing global heating year on year. It's the severity of this particular event managed to take people by surprise. And so what kind of, and David referenced this a bit in his opening comments, is how do we prepare for situations that we can't yet even fully imagine? And I think this is where, there was a comment about the media and why is there a focus on the physical impacts? And I think that is in part because of a reliance on physical science to understand these issues. But we need the role of social sciences and creative approaches, utopian thinking, scenario building to imagine different possible scenarios and really create thought experiments as a society for how we might impact if Manchester were impacted by such a severe heat dome, and really think through these proactively rather than waiting until they're on our doorstep, but actually make this part of good governance. Yeah.
Thank you very much. David, I will turn to you because there's a number of questions coming about donors and pre-positioning, and I mean, you probably had a chance to have a look at them, but really the first one from Nick is about short-termism in funding. The second one is about, from Miriam, is about pre-positioning. That relates to the question of how do we work with the private sector. So would you like to respond to these particular points?
Sure. I'm just looking at the short-term funding one. Regards to yep. Okay, so yeah, I think we've all been struck by how some countries have had to scale back their funding for humanitarian response, how others have picked it up. I think the issue here is, I think I'd probably go back to Paul's point, which is that there is going to come a realization that there is common cause here. Now, we may not quite have reached that point yet, and I can see the questions here sort of questioning, well, how much funding are we actually likely to get? And we're always struggling for funding. We're always at least a 30% shortfall, and I suspect that proportion will probably stay. But the question is, how do we garner in more? Because what we're talking about is a situation in which we are going to require greater resources in order to deal with a greater scale of problem. I would personally feel that there is a level of, as I said at the beginning, inevitability about what we're about to see. And it goes back to the media question right at the beginning. The media hasn't concentrated on this because there is an understanding, there is a feeling, a perception that we're talking about something far into the future, or at least midterm anyway, that we probably don't have to worry about now. And I think we're coming to the collective realization that we do have to worry about it now. We do. It is impacting upon us, and it's not just impacting upon countries far away about which we know little. It is impacting on Western developed countries, and they are seeing impacts that they are unable to respond effectively to without some kind of external assistance. And I think that realization of that common cause can go two ways. It can make people retrench into fervent nationalism and nativism and protect their own exclusively, or it can make people look outside of their own shell in the certainty, frankly, that creating common cause with others probably makes us all more resilient and stronger. Now, it is my fervent hope that we go down the second path rather than the first. And I think we all have a part to play in which path we take. And I would say that to that end, it never hurts to have a plan. Whether the plan that we are presenting at this point is the plan that ultimately is realized, I do not know, because there are discussions, there are stakeholders, there are compromises that inevitably have to be made, and some of those will, I'm sure, be around money and resources. However, I think in presenting practical solutions and putting them on the table and pushing them forward, I think we can only support and assist the situation in pointing out to all of those policymakers, practitioners, people engaged in, you know, private commerce, and the private individual on the street, that we all have common cause to make here. It's essential that the situation changes positively for the better, and that we plan and structure our way out of this. It's essential. And I think that the realization of that will dawn on everybody sooner or later. And part of this report is to push exactly that point.
We have several questions related that correlate directly to your response, but I may turn to, I may invite any of you to respond really on this one, but how do we create a big enough nudge to jolt the system? That's one question from Gareth. And another question is, how confident are we of being able to mobilize the sector as a whole on this, including the relevant UN agencies? Well, that's one that I may turn to Paul for. So I think this is so far the conversation that we've had on transforming the humanitarian sector. Somebody else is asking whether we are taking into consideration longer-term development interventions. So there you go, a nice little package, 3 questions that I think really talk to each other quite nicely. So any of you want to respond before I actually push it on one of you specifically? Paul, go ahead, start.
Yeah, I'm happy to have a go. And I see Miriam's going to dive in as well, because they are cutting right to the heart of it. The nudge, on the nudge issue, I think it's about what we actually think about how this change is going to happen. As David has said, I think there's some inevitability in this anyway, you know, because the world is going to be changing so very fast. The private sector is changing so very fast. The political, economic situation in which we're working is going to be changing very fast. That we're not in a static system, you know, it is going to have to be pulled in some direction. And I think we need to come from there. The job then is going to be, how are we ready to optimize? How are we ready to surf? How are we ready to really make the best of those changes? And I'm skeptical that that is going to be through multiple working groups and policies and at the policy level. I think the way that's going to happen is we're going to do stuff. I think what's happening is that many civil society organizations, many non-recognized humanitarians are already doing things. And the more of those things we do, the more it will create the circumstances that will bring people on board. If you think about cash really, much of it came about because people were working on it, and then it forces, those changes force other changes in the system. So I think the nudge doesn't come at policy level. I think the nudge comes from action on the ground. Do I think that will bring people on board? Do I think people will come on board? I mean, I've been amazed. I started working on this after the State of the System in 2018, when I was surprised, having been involved in the writing of that, how little climate change was being discussed when we did the interviews and the meetings and so on. It just really wasn't an issue that came up almost at all. That is only 2.5 years ago, but I think the conversations now are fundamentally different. You have the Charter, which the Red Cross movement has pushed forward. I know OCHA's working on this. WFP is working on it. The difference, I think, is that 2 years ago, people were not necessarily engaged at all. Now, I think the question is rather different. It's not what's the issue here. I think it's what do we do? I think people have become engaged, and many, many people are stuck for what that means programmatically and strategically. But that's a long way to go in 2 years, George. And I think with action that shows what we can do, we can go a hell of a lot, pardon me, we can go a lot further in the next 2.
Miriam.
Thank you. So Paul, you grab the cash and market-based approaches as one of the shifts that we very much have promoted in the last 8 years or so. And it has been through very intentional investment that we achieved that. And I think that what we should do or contribute to make this possible is to keep the pulse on the field. I don't think that if we invest, there can be a change. And I don't think there is a lack necessarily of standards. What our risk is to elaborate, articulate our theories that are disconnected from the field. The biggest fear is that in the country level, country by country and with a cumulative effect, say, oh, great, this is the right thing to say, it doesn't apply to us. So I think that's the main issue. When we check that our principles and theory of change and every tool that we develop is operational and it actually reflects what our colleagues in the ground need, then it's adopted. And there is, again, a cumulative effect of people doing this switch. So there is not one way to change one way or another. We will continue to, in some cases, have a prepositioning of emergency items, but we are working now. Prepositioning might be having framework agreements with financial service providers to provide assistance to cash. And then there is the connection with private sector. Even we might or might not have the MOU with local vendors. So again, it is like to make sure that our discussions in these arenas are very much field tested and be courageous to say this might not be the thing that sounds right, but this is what is efficient and is helpful, and be able to get back and rewrite our paragraphs in the global level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are several more questions about, one is about the relationship between humanitarian aid and the sector at large and its ability to reform. Mela makes the point that climate change is often highlighted as a challenge, particularly in the global south, and that limits the kind of attention and resources directed to the situation. I'd like to make a point. It's a minor point, but it's as a historian of humanitarian aid, it's worth remembering, and we tend to forget, that the North-South relationship that we now take for granted as the basis of humanitarian aid has not always been the way humanitarian aid was deployed. Humanitarian aid was deployed from west to east, was deployed north to north, south to south. And I think we tend to refire a little bit humanitarian aid as being a north-south relationship. It has historically not been, for most of its history, flowing that way. So that's something I'd like to point out, because otherwise we might find the future a little bit challenging, because it is likely to be again flowing in directions such as north-north or east-west, west-east, south-south. So just to point out, so how can we challenge that narrative? Maybe Stephanie, because you are working on the north and disasters in the north notably.
I think that that narrative is already being challenged, that the nudge is coming in the form of severe weather events that are impacting communities, countries around the world. So unfortunately, there's going to be this solidarity created globally by exposure to severe weather events, whether it's heat waves in Canada, wildfires in Australia, flooding events in Tanzania. It's something that we're unfortunately all too soon going to have in common. And so I think that dynamic will be shifting. Now, it's come up, the theme of COVID and the impact that will have on traditional donor countries, and what that might have, how that might fiscally translate is another question. But on that note, the Green Climate Fund, which is a mechanism to transfer funds from high income contexts to low income contexts, it looks like it might reach its target of $100 billion annually for the first time this year. Knock on all pieces of wood next to you. But that suggests a potential shift. As Paula said, something has just shifted in the past couple of years. Things are shifting in these weeks leading up to COP26. What could happen in coming months and years? So the landscape is changing. That dynamic is shifting.
Now we have two questions which are perhaps hinting at some pessimism. One from, I think it's Adam Bertou. Most of the report's recommendation, more resourcing, early warning, early action, better partnerships, etc. have been made before. So how to get through to policymakers to get a different outcome this time round? So I'll take that first half the question, and maybe David, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I thought that one was coming my way. Yeah, and Adam, we've had those conversations before, I think. So I think the reality here is, out of the recommendations that are put in the report, yes, indeed, some of them are perhaps not new. Some of them are new, but some less so. I think the part of the reason is we're attempting not to put them out there in a sort of vacuum. You know, let's just make things better. I don't think that's what we're saying. What we're saying is, let's coalesce around a targeted response to this multiplier effect. And how do we best do that? And there are a number of recommendations in there. So I think one is that we're not sort of putting it out in a sort of generalized vacuum that you know often happens in the humanitarian sector. And that I think, Gareth Owen of SAVE, who also asked the next question, I think, who always says that humanitarians are always saying the sky is falling in. And that's true. You know, we always do. We're running around saying things are terrible. I think what we are saying is that, look, there are some very targeted things that we can do in order to give ourselves the best opportunity to deal with the problems that we're already baked in here. And yes, some of these things may have been said before, some of them are newer, but we need to put all these things together. We need to re-examine, we need to look at some of these now properly, please. And I think I personally am not saying that the aid system is completely broken and we need to throw it out and create a new one, which I think is the second part of your question, Adam. And I don't think you were saying that either, but you're putting it out there. I think, you know, the system's the system. We've been talking about changing the system for as long as I've been in it, which is about 25 years now. And, you know, we do incremental this and salami tactic that, and, you know, some things get a little bit better and other things just sort of stumble along. I think what we're proposing here is something that is actually going to help bolster not just the humanitarian system. It's not just about the humanitarian system. This is about the wider stakeholders. This is about national governments. This is about NDMAs. This is about ministries of health. This is about local civil society. This is about local communities. This is about local corporates or international corporates. And when we come back to the issue, which I suspect, Bertrand, you were going to, which was about the money, how do we identify more new additional money? I think part of that is actually we need to have conversations with new actors. And again, I'm aware that we have in the humanitarian sector been talking about new sources of money, new donors for absolutely years. I know that we have. However, I think that we have reached a situation now where many of those larger corporates and big philanthropy is increasingly of an understanding that this affects them directly. And actually, this is something that they need to step into. It's an arena in which they need to have a positive impact. They cannot simply stand back anymore and leave it to international governments as part of an extension of foreign policy. We need to look at new sources of support, money, and it's not just about the money. It's also about people, and it's about relationships. So it's about how do we best engender those relationships with the contexts that are most vulnerable, but other contexts as well, and ensure that across the entire humanitarian and, you know, for want of being grandiose, the human endeavor, that we actually ensure that we are all pulling together in order to address this. It's not just about the humanitarian sector and humanitarian purity and in some way bolstering our own system exclusively. It's about how do we ensure that we are part of a general solution here, and how do we engage actors outside of that traditional humanitarian sector? Because everyone is groping around for a plan. Everyone, I think. No one has an answer to this, whether it's government, whether it's corporates, whether it's individual policymakers, gurus sitting on mountaintops, or the humanitarians that sit in front of you. No one has a perfect answer, but there has to be a conversation. It has to start now. There is no way around it. Bertrand.
Thank you very much. Now, there's a few more points that are made. I mean, can I just stress the fact that we shouldn't be prisoner of our own metaphors. The humanitarian system is a way of thinking about humanitarian aid that's 30 years old. We've been doing humanitarian aid for hundreds of years. So it's not something that we should necessarily. And if we think about the word system, we can think of ecosystem. We can actually engage with this in much more organic forms that it will take and is taking. So is the system broken? Well, I think it's perhaps one of those questions that actually traps us in a particular way of thinking, and we need to move beyond that. That's my personal viewpoint on this issue. Anyway, there are some other. So, in other words, Terry, I think your pessimism, or your cynical question, as you call it, is there a point where we say that we're not fit for purpose, and make it clear that humanitarian action is not sufficient to meet the scale of the needs? To be honest, I'm not entirely sure that humanitarians have ever claimed that they could meet the scale of the needs. I don't think that's ever been the claim. I think there is a quixotic nature in the humanitarian endeavor, and I don't think humanitarians could ever claim that they're going to meet the scale of the needs, because most of the needs are going to be met by other people than humanitarians. So I think it's actually perhaps again a perspective that we ought to challenge. Now, a final point is from Jennifer. Enabling collective anticipatory action at scale is among the most widely shared recommendations. That's very true. And combining this with our localization agenda is a real opportunity. But we know that much greater effort are needed to push towards the localization agenda. We need to do better at identifying not only the barriers, but also the enablers within the existing aid system. I think this is a very interesting point. Does anyone want to comment on it? Apart from David? Miriam? Do you want to say anything?
It goes back to the very first point. Maybe if I repeat that sentence will make more sense now, that all the partnership, the localization, the work we have been, the efforts and challenges we have faced for the last decades went focused to deliver together a set of like assistance to this specific group or to implement a specific project. Now these partnerships have to go to reach the others. So the ones that are not part of our so-called target group. So, and also to understand we have a specific mandate. Within NRC, we respond mostly to people affected by conflict, but overall affected by this displacement. This displacement now is also caused by climate change, and we respond to the climate change impact during displacement. But one thing is to be displaced by climate change, and which how do you say, affects specific group, and the other one is to say affected by climate change, which is every human in the planet and other also species and our ecosystem. And we have never claimed to say we are going to respond to that universe. So I think to be true to our mandate, when we say we need to speak up, we need to speak up for the group that we are committed to serve and work with. So I think this kind of is not only about a partnership to deliver, it is synergy, is emergence, that these new systems will multiply the effect of one collaboration. So 1 + 1 = 5. That's our goal, our ambitions. And I think we need to move from saying we are a capacity building agency for local staff to say, how are we going to address, how are we going to, and market systems, only one of the systems within the communities we work. I think that when we need to invest more in localization, when is applicable, we already know what are the preconditions before we go in the go-no-go through a market based approach. Now to work in other systems, we also need to develop that and test and learn from this implementation. What are the preconditions before we say we go and how we can contribute together. So I think that's why very much all of us made very much an emphasis in collaboration in order as a precondition to scale up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, we are coming to the end of this webinar, so thank you very much to our speakers. I'd like you to carry on this conversation by sharing the report, by continuing this conversation with us, by signing up for update, and by passing on the message that we are looking towards the establishment of a genuinely powerful and vocal and active alliance for climate change. So thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to thank our speakers, and I'll be the only one clapping, but I think our speakers deserve a good clap. So if you, in the privacy of your room, please raise your hands and clap and thank them very much. So there we are. Thank you very much, everyone. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much for the questions. They were as brilliant as we expected them to be. Thank you.
Thank you.